very proud to announce today's keynote talk by Elisabeth Oberzaucher. Elisabeth is originally from Carinthia, from Greifenburg, and she is now president of the International Society of Human Ethology and a member of the famous Science Busters. Elisabeth shows us that it is possible, also for a girl who's from a rural region far away from the big cities, to make an international career and to be a very renowned researcher in her field. Therefore, she is the perfect role model for all of us, and we are glad to have her here on stage. Elisabeth will give us a talk on the limits of our gut feeling and the necessity of data for understanding the world. Elisabeth, the stage is yours.
Wow, I'm still struggling because this was such a beautiful performance, so I have goose pimples as well. This was wonderful, and this was actually exactly what I was thinking of when I first talked to Anita, that, you know, data by itself is beautiful. People who actually take data and make information from data, make us understand data, that's beautiful, and that's so essential for our world. And that's what I want to talk about today. I'm a behavioral biologist, so you might ask yourself, why am I here? The thing is, as behavioral biologists, we observe behavior, and we do a lot of data collection, and then we usually need, in order to really understand what the data is telling us, people like you, people who make us see sense in all that complex behavior that us people show. And I'm also going to talk about the limits of our gut feeling, because, you know, we go through our everyday world and we know things, but maybe we don't. My approach to scientific data in general and scientific world is an evolutionary one. So I look at the way how we are in general from an evolutionary point of view, because our evolutionary history has been a very interesting one. Things changed, challenges arose, and we had to develop new ideas, new answers to these new challenges throughout our evolutionary history. And these new ideas, how to cope with these challenges, sometimes they just left traces in us. They left traces in us and still shape us in the way how we are. And there is one period in our evolutionary history that was really, really, really big in terms of impact in how we manifest ourselves today. And that's a period that actually followed a... Das ist meins. So my phone is being stolen. It's okay. So one period was actually a climate change that led to a lot of new developments. It was in the other direction, it was an ice age, and it was not man-made back then. But what happened is that during an ice age, a lot of water is actually ice. And this water, that is mostly in the polar regions, that is lacking elsewhere on the planet. And then something bad happens for the people or the animals or the plants that live in the rainforests around the equatorial region. Because the rainforests shrink, and that's where our ancestors until then lived. And when such a rainforest shrinks, it becomes uncomfortable. You have to find a way either to outcompete others or to be maybe like, a bit clever and say, okay, maybe elsewhere it's beautiful too. And that's actually what our ancestors did, or those that were successfully our ancestors. They went from the rainforest to the savanna in East Africa. And the savanna in East Africa is very different from the rainforest. And that's why our ancestors had to develop very new things in order to cope with these surroundings. So, for example, that we walk on 2 legs rather than on 4, that is actually thanks to the savanna. But also things like that we live in larger groups and actually can cope with it cognitively, thanks to the savanna, because we had to come together in bigger groups, because this helped us to cope with predators much better. So we talk about the savanna still as the environment of evolutionary adaptedness, because so many new inventions took place in this habitat, and also many of those inventions are still within us and still shape us today. Not only our bodies, but also our perception, our cognition, and our behavior. And the perception, I have to enter some German into this talk, because I think perception in German is called Wahrnehmung, truth-taking, truth-taking. So in the German word, it says, okay, our senses actually take the truth out of the things that happen around us, and we make truth by perceiving what's out around us. This is not true, right? We know that our senses, they are strong filters. We're not perceiving everything unfiltered that happens around us. It has something to do with each other, but it's not in like a objective way to look at things. So I will take you through some examples where we perceive things as true, but where this might not be so true after all. So what we perceive as truth, for example, in risk-taking. This is one. I have to go back quick. Who of you has a car? Whoa, this has to change. So who of you has an SUV? So a big car. Okay, that's a few, okay. Much better, at least. Okay, so, and then if I were to ask you why you have an SUV, many would say, oh, you know, it's really nice because you sit up high and you have a really good overview of what happens around you. And that's why people love SUVs. Well, the truth, the objective truth, looks different. So this is a blind zone test. So where do you actually see? And you can see that in the case of SUVs, the big cars, you have a much bigger area where you actually don't see, because the car is in the way. And the smaller the car is, the better it actually gets. So it's completely the other way around, right? So we don't really see when we think we see. And that's actually true for risk-taking in general. And as a behavioral scientist, I measure risk-taking by how big is the distance people take to an object, because if the distance is bigger, apparently the perceived risk is higher. So what we did was we observed people in the underground station, and we looked at the distance they took from the border of the platform in order to wait for the train. And you know, when the train enters the station, it's rather fast, and then it gets slower and slower, and then it comes to a stop. And indeed, we perceive the risk that it emanates from the train in a different manner, depending on the velocity. So where the train is fast, people actually are very far away from the edge of the platform. But where the train comes to a stop, people almost touch the train with their noses, right? Very stupid behavior, because if you do so, this actually means that, you know, even a slow train can actually do substantial damage. It's a heavy thing. So, gut feeling, not so good. Also, when we talk about distances, how we perceive distances, I do a lot of research in how to construct vehicles in public transport. And so for example, I was talking to the people who constructed this, this tram, because one of the biggest issues of people with this tram was actually that it's too narrow. And then the constructor said, well, at the most narrow spot, it's actually very wide. Yeah? So you can have a trolley standing there and you can still squeeze by, that's possible, which is not possible in this other case. So this is very narrow. But still, you will agree with me that the left vehicle appears to be much more narrower than the right vehicle, and that's because we don't perceive distances in metrics, but we perceive them in a context. And when we design things for people, we should take that into account, that people work differently, right? So it goes both ways. And then, I'm very sorry about the German, that's still in my slides. And then the perception of others. We tend to perceive others as most annoying people, right? And especially when we recall about the mask-wearing things that we had now for 2 years, we always perceived like, oh, I'm doing everything right, yeah? But I'm surrounded by all those people who have their noses hanging out, who actually need their jaws to be warmed and things like that. Huh? But if you look at how people behave, and we did a study in 8 different countries and observed how people actually do with mask wearing, it turns out that the picture is very different. So most people actually do very fine, and it's very few that violate the rules. And that perception error is actually not a bad perception error in the first place, because you want to detect the violations of rules. And if you think of how our newspapers would be written if we would write about everything equally, it would be like, oh, there was no bank robbery, no accident, nothing happened. Boring, boring, boring. And then the whole newspaper, and then the little thing in the end, there would be such a short paragraph where we would talk about the things that actually fill our newspapers. And that's, of course, efficient because we don't want to waste our limited capacities of our minds on things we don't need to think about anyway, because they're okay. But, of course, if we want to understand the world, it's not really a good thing. Others are very important for us because they can actually act from themselves. And others are usually connected with faces, or were so in our evolutionary history. And that's why our face detection is very, very prominent and very dominant. So we see faces everywhere, even there where there are none. So we see faces in patterns, we see faces in cars, and not only that we see faces, but we can actually say, oh, this is a nice face. I like this face. And if you look at these boxes, you would all agree with which of those 3 boxes you would not want to collaborate. No? So you don't want to collaborate with this, huh? Nah. I think we are all on the same page that this is the one we would not, the frowny face, we would not want to collaborate. Because, of course, these emotional expressions of agents, they tell us what this agent is going to do next with a higher likelihood. So probably not so nice in that case. As a behavioral scientist, I also think about how we think. Oh no, another thing, before we go there. When do you board a tram? That's actually a very interesting question, because people, when you ask them the question, they will tell you, oh, I board the tram, there are 3 seats, but they will remain standing, because why should I sit down? I only have a few stops to go. That's actually what our survey tells us. So some people actually say they would go rather prefer to remain standing for more than half an hour rather than to sit down, even though there are free seats. Highly unbelievable. A behavioral scientist can actually look at that and say, yeah, they are not telling the truth. People don't tell the untruth because they want to lie to us, but because they're just not aware of much of the things they are doing every day. So this is just a thing you're doing intuitively. Your gut is telling you what to do. So your brain doesn't even know what you're doing all day long. Which is actually also something I want to share with you in the handling of survey data, right? Don't believe everything people tell you. Our gut feeling basically bases its decisions on very simple algorithms that have been developed to solve problems back in the savannah, right? Back there. And there we talk about something like error management. That's probably something not new for you, because error management is something we do all day long. We try to avoid the costly errors, but we have to allow for some errors because there's no such thing as a perfect algorithm, right? And that's true for our brains as well, of course. There is a sexual dimorphism in error management regarding the assessment of the interest of a potential reproduction partner. So if we go around and ask men whether they think a woman shows interest in them, they will tend to estimate their outlook a bit higher than it actually is, and women will tend to estimate a bit lower. That's studies done by Marty Hazelton and David Buss all over the world, and the sexual dimorphism, it's not black and white, that men say, oh, women are mine, and women say, oh, no, none of them is interested, so it's not that black and white, but there is a sexual dimorphism. We then thought, okay, how is it with this sexual dimorphism? Can we also apply this to other topics, to other themes that are not closely related to sexual reproduction? And we used this problem. So you see this problem, which is actually a metal ring and a metal star, and they are intertwined. And the question is whether you can actually separate those two from each other without breaking them. And when people look at that, we ask two questions. We say, do you think it's possible per se? And do you think you can do it, right? And this is really a nice and simple idea. We did a lot of studies with that, and usually we find a nice sexual dimorphism. That's actually quite interesting because we not only ask them before, then we give it for 2 minutes to them, they can try, they fail, and then we ask them again. And you see that we have a slight sexual dimorphism before the manipulation, so both are actually rather pessimistic and say, I rather tend to say it's not possible. But women are a bit more pessimistic than men. And then, after having failed, still men are a bit less pessimistic than women, but they grow a bit more pessimistic. I'm going to say something that is not in the data, but just to make it, to illustrate it a bit higher. So men say, okay, I can do it. Then they try, and then after failing, they say, if I can do it, it's not possible. That's just a joke, right? You all know that this is not in the data because this is not supported. So we did a lot of studies there, and then at some point I thought, okay, maybe it's an interesting question to ask, when does this sexual dimorphism manifest? Is this something that happens during puberty, that we have this sexual dimorphism? And I will actually skip that because we did different problems, but it's the same thing. So I asked a student who did her vorwissenschaftliche Arbeit, that's something they have to do together with their A-levels, and she collected data with pupils before puberty, after puberty, so 11-year-olds and 16-year-olds used the same problem, the same setup, in order to figure out whether pre-puberty we don't have a sexual dimorphism and post-puberty it's there. So she did it, and that's the results. Gone! No sexual dimorphism, neither before nor after puberty. So yes, sample size is smaller, but still, I mean, even if we increase the sample size tenfold, I'm pretty certain that no effect would surface. And that got me thinking, and I thought, okay, why in this case doesn't it happen? And then I noticed, okay, there is something different, because I'm teaching at biology department, very many women, at least at the students level. And so basically our experimenters used to be women, young women, talking to other adult people. And then I have a student that is slightly older than her subjects. It's a very different setup, right? So I started to play around with this experimental setup, and I had a male student collecting data. The sexual dimorphism was still there, but the effect size was much smaller. And then I took it on the next level, because then I took away the personal interaction altogether. So I went to the theater, like here, in a talk. I used SurveyMonkey for people to really just type into their smartphone their answers. And also, no sexual dimorphism. And then I had a really big data set with the Science Busters, where people could actually join in from all Austria while watching the TV show. So it's thousands of data, no sexual dimorphism. Ha! So the experimental setup changed completely the results. And I've changed the way how I see what the data was actually telling me. So it was actually not a difference, a sexual dimorphism in thinking that we've been measuring, but it was a sexual dimorphism in communication. And why am I talking to you about this study, especially to you? I think, especially in fields where women are still highly underrepresented, we must be aware of that. So, if you have a problem and you have one person in the room who says, I'm going to solve it, and the other person says, oh, I see that it might be a problem, I'm going to try my best, I'm not promising anything. With high likelihood, those two people will solve the problem to an equal extent. But your expectation is, of course, that the person says, oh, no problem, I'm going to solve it. This guy is the guy who solves your problem. And I'm consciously gendering here, and the girl who says, yeah, I'm going to try, and she's probably even more successful because she's going to bite into the problem and really try to solve it. You say, okay, yeah, she didn't believe in it, but she was lucky. Awareness, okay? So when people talk differently about their problem-solving capacities, then take into account what might be their upbringing and where does this come from. But back to the gut feeling. Why is it so stupid? Why is it telling us to do things that actually don't make sense? It has something to do with that. Because it hasn't, evolutionarily speaking, it hasn't been too long since we left the savannah. So on a biological level, we haven't had much time to evolve beyond that stage. We don't have these gut feelings for global, urban, climate change, name it, problems. That's what our mind is too stupid for. And that's why we have to actually use our brains because our biologically evolved cognitive algorithms, they will not suffice to give us informed and good answers to the current problems. And on the other hand, we are lucky because we are not only biological beings, we are also social and cultural beings. And we know how to bring together many minds in science. And this combination of many minds, they can actually solve the big problems. But if you think that your gut is wiser than the scientific community, then you're lost. Thank you.
Lisa, thank you very much for this brilliant and exciting talk. And I think you put into words also why we are here, and you tried to explain us also a bit of our evolutionary background, so why we also need to push forward women in data science. And as I said before in my introduction, we feel that you're a role model for us. Do you have a suggestion or a recommendation for young women? You know, we also have young students here, female students studying mathematics, informatics, techniques, data science, and as you also said in a little sentence, professors later are mainly male. Do you have a recommendation?
It's hard. I was also lucky that I had a fantastic mentor. Actually, by chance, we just had our offices next to each other, so we never collaborated scientifically. But she was such a cool woman that I just believed that it's possible. So I think that was very, very important, and we also used each other to reflect on all the things that were going wrong, right? So I think it's important to just, so from an individual point of view, to make it possible and not to suffer in silence. Find your supporters. I think that's the important thing. And they are not necessarily female. Yeah? So there are excellent guys out there who will be very supportive, and there are women out there who are not at all. Don't be intimidated by those who tell you just because of your femaleness, color, cultural background, being a rural person, not coming from an academic background, all of that might actually be risen as a reason why you cannot make it. Don't believe them. You can make it. It's probably a bit harder for you, but still, it's possible. And if you don't make it, I think this is also important. If you feel that you're failing, the system is just too strong, and it doesn't work out the way you want it to. I think in this case, also don't accept it as your own failure, but the system is still quite broken, right? And if you feel that it goes beyond your strength, don't think you are wrong. The system is wrong.
Thank you very much.